why or an atheist, not that you are having those good reasons to. That's explicitly why I put that in the beginning. There are people who are atheists, and some only really describes just life. So that would accurately describe Joseph Stalin as well as Bertrand Russell, even though they disagree on basically.
Russell, of course, who is one for being a non-believer in his life, I no longer use the word atheist because I realise that intellectually it's not sustainable. He said, I believe that as a materialist, unless materialist doesn't mean just as a materialist, unless I can see every I can ever see there is no God. I can believe that no God, but I can never see that there's no God. I no longer use the word atheist.
Right, and I think in passage it says that, well, we can't really be sure, but that's where his teaching document comes in, where the likeness to like the flying spaghetti monster and fairies. Actually, the first one is not as silly as it sounds, right? Because there were periods of time, there were periods of time and places where people generally believed in fairies. My own family, my very father, generally in England, believed that there were little people that followed. Yeah, exactly. And the responsible, they're actually reacting in their own lives. If you lost something in your house, then it would believe that the people have taken it, and there's these little nymphs running around. Oh no. That'd be horrifying. I think that's so. I don't think that's as offensive as it sounds. Like, if we believe that there's no reasons anymore for believing in fairies, I think likely we'll find very many good reasons to believe in God in the future.
I mean, you have to believe in fairies, and
no, but that's a large point. That'd be where we realize more about how the memory system works, right? So it's likely that you forgot that this spoon in the right? And I think, like in nature, that there's a time when a lot of these are quite old for theater.
Arthur Conan, I read a biography of not very biography, of Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes creator, and of course he did believe in fairies, and he had photographs of a couple of people who were convinced genuine. But he abandoned very careful from a spiritualist. Atheists talk about Santa Claus, the standard one, and the email from people saying, friend, people who believe in Santa Claus, I believe in Santa Claus when I was 5. Probably not true. As I grew older, maturity, thought, and sort, I abandoned the idea. And I wasn't raised. As I got older, I read, I developed a God. There's overwhelming evidence to show that often they increase their belief in God. Evidence to show that people grow older and less responsible in spirit, they refuse to be Santa anymore.
Well, actually, I'd say that I think you're drawing a parallel that doesn't really exist. Right? Because, I'd say that belief in God, especially when you cite statistics that say that people become more religious when they get older, I think that's largely because there's the tendency to become religious because of the graphics and how part of the research in the last 20 years that old people tend to be religious simply because
over 14, 15. Okay, let's make it simpler then. How many people at the age of 21 are convinced this is Santa Claus? How many people over the age of 21 are convinced it's a God? And the people over the age of 21 did believe in God at their age, but did believe in Santa. Clearly, people abandon us in some ways become mature, and they break the belief often when they become mature. To compare the belief in God and Santa or areas, migrationary arguments that put forward that's really a issue.
Oh no, well, I was actually giving that in response to earlier. So the point of bringing up fairies is that we have evidence for necessarily no evidence or necessary evidence for God.
Point to go to break, and we'll wait for that to come back. And the fairy community, I mean, I did no harm anyway. But interesting point you made here. Fairies, there's no they exist, but equally, where evidence
very this analogy following. We have evidence that fairies do not exist. The reason people don't believe in Santa Claus is not simply there's a lack of evidence. There's good evidence that there is no such person. By contrast, God, I think we have both good evidence for the existence of God that I enumerated earlier. Michael considered a good argument that there is no God. The atheist here had a burden of proof to sustain that there is no such being as God, and I don't think this is a burden that the atheist can carry. I'd like to come back to an earlier point I made too, and that is the notion that atheists are somehow the intelligence among us and so forth. I think this is just completely false. The state of in the way this Harris and Hitchens and so forth are not sophisticated intellectually. These are, for the most part, bitter, diatribe against religion. How someone like Dawkins, a good scientist in his field, when he wants to talk about philosophy and theology, he is a layman. And God Delusion is a very unsophisticated book intellectually. As a philosopher, I was just at the arguments he gives in that book. It's an embarrassment, really, I think.
I agree. Michael, well,
thank you too.
If you look at the reviews, yes, but this book, look at the reviews, they're quite damning. This work with Christians is a bright lie. This is not a fun book, it's a fun book. So I think most people would agree that the three book in what they've read is not first class scholarship. However, our first class scholars and intellectuals do not at all.
But over the last 50 years, since the late 1960s, a literal revolution in my discipline, philosophy, in the Anglo-American world. We thought about a renaissance of Christian philosophy, such that some of our finest philosophers from prestigious universities are now outspoken Christians.
Where is this philosophical revolution taking place?
The Anglo-American realm.
One's dominated by assumed atheists like people who really dominate. Well, I'm sorry, I just have heard that.
I think meant air. This is the icon. I'm talking about today.
Let's talk about people from like Klein.
He's dead too.
Well, died.
I'm sorry to fair, yeah, but I mean,
let's talk about. Let's name names. People like Richard Swinburne at Oxford University, Robert Marilyn Adams at Oxford, Brian Left at Oxford, people like Alvin Planning at University of Notre Dame, and Wigan, Dallas Willard, Eleanor. I mean, I could go on naming names at top universities in America and England who are outspoken critics, such that the face of my 1900s British Swinburne era were down. It has utterly transformed.
Well, I'd have to disagree. I did something about philosophical tradition and what's going on in it now. I think that I think you're frankly just choosing people that are theists. And if there were theists who are also philosophers, it doesn't follow at all that the position of philosophy justified just as philosophers.
No, it does follow that it is not true that the brightest